Ever heard of a guy named Lou Pearlman?
Oh, yeah. Can't say I haven't.
He was the mastermind behind some of the biggest boy bands of the 90s, the Backstreet Boys and SYNC.
Yeah, those were the days.
But behind the catchy tunes and the synchronized dance moves, there's a darker story.
Oh, a darker story, huh?
This guy wasn't just a music mogul. He was also running one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history.
Wow, that's a heck of a twist.
Yeah.
So, what are we diving into today?
Well, we're going to take a deep dive into the life and crimes of Lou Pearlman.
Sounds juicy. What are our sources for this deep dive?
We've got a couple of great ones. First, we're using an episode of the podcast American Scandal, which really digs into the whole Ponzi scheme angle.
I've heard that one. They always do such a great job.
And we're also using this book called Hit Charade by Tyler Gray. It gives a really fascinating look into Pearlman's life and the whole boy band phenomenon.
Nice. So, what's the mission for today's deep dive?
We're going to try to uncover how Pearlman went from being an aviation entrepreneur to a boy band mogul, while leaving a trail of financial devastation in his wake.
It's amazing how someone can be so successful in one area and then completely crash and burn in another.
Right. And we'll also be exploring how his carefully constructed persona masked a web of deceit that impacted everyone from investors to the artists themselves.
Can't wait to get into it. Where do we start?
Well, our story begins in Orlando, Florida.
Orlando, the land of Mickey Mouse and theme parks. What's that got to do with boy bands and Ponzi schemes?
Well, Pearlman saw something different in Orlando. He called it the attention economy.
Attention economy. Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he mean by that?
He basically saw Orlando as this breeding ground for aspiring stars, a place where dreams of fame and fortune were abundant, perfect for scouting talent for his boy band ventures.
Makes sense. But wasn't there also some kind of legal loophole that made Orlando attractive to him?
You're right, there was. It was the Florida Homestead Act.
Right. I've heard of that. That protects your primary residence from being seized even if you go bankrupt.
Exactly. So even if his schemes went bust, he could keep his fancy mansion. Talk about a safety net, huh?
Pretty clever, if you ask me. But before we get to the boy bands and the Ponzi scheme, let's rewind a bit. Turns out Pearlman had a history of shady dealings long before he got into the music industry.
Oh, yeah. Like what? Give me the dirt.
Well, there's this story about a photographer named Wheat Wartzberger who worked for Pearlman's modeling agency.
Hold on, modeling agency? This guy was involved in everything.
He sure was, but this wasn't exactly high fashion. Think more like bait and switch.
Bait and switch, how so?
Pearlman would send Wheat on these model scouting road trips across the country.
Yeah.
They'd lure people in with promises of modeling careers, charge them a hefty fee for headshots, and then nothing.
So no one actually became a model? What a scam.
And to make matters worse, the checks Wheat got for his photography work started bouncing. Early sign that Pearlman wasn't exactly trustworthy.
It's crazy how those early signs were there all along. But you know what's even crazier? Before the modeling agency, Pearlman started his career in a completely different field, aviation.
Aviation, like planes and stuff, that's a far cry from boy bands.
I know, right? He was into helicopters, blimps,
Yeah.
you name it. He even started a helicopter transportation service, shuttling business travelers between New York and New Jersey.
A legitimate businessman, at least in the beginning. So when did the boy band idea come about?
Well, the story goes that he got the idea after chartering a plane for a then little-known group called the New Kids on the Block.
The New Kids on the Block? Wow, that's a blast from the past.
Right. Pearlman claimed they paid him in a suitcase full of cash, and that's when the light bulb went off.
Wait, so he saw these kids rolling in cash and thought, I want a piece of that.
Pretty much. But here's the thing. Maurice Starr, the manager of New Kids on the Block, says that story never happened.
Oh, really? So Pearlman was embellishing the truth a bit. Or a lot.
Sounds like it. Seems like stretching the truth was a bit of a habit for him. But you know what's interesting? Pearlman actually did have a musical background himself.
He did. I never knew that. What instrument did he play?
He played guitar in a band called Flyer back in his Queens days. And get this, he even tried his hand at managing them.
No way. Was he any good?
Well, let's just say he was already making promises he couldn't keep, like a world tour and a record deal with Columbia Records.
Uh-oh. Sounds familiar. Over-promising and under-delivering, even back then.
Exactly. And that brings us to the birth of Transcontinental Records. This is where he started scouting and training his future boy band stars.
And I'm guessing this is where the Ponzi scheme really starts to take shape.
You got it.
Mm-hmm.
He needed a ton of money to fund this venture, and he wasn't afraid to get creative. Or should I say, deceptive.
Deceptive is putting it mildly. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars swindled from investors, banks, family, friends, even his own barber.
The man was a master manipulator. He used his charm and the allure of the music industry to convince people to part with their savings.
I bet he targeted people close to him, people who trusted him.
Absolutely. He preyed on their trust and exploited their dreams of a comfortable retirement. It's heartbreaking.
So how did he pull it off for so long? How do you convince people to hand over their life savings?
Well, he created this thing called an employee savings plan, which sounds a lot like a legitimate retirement account.
So he tapped into people's desire for a secure future.
Exactly. And to make it even more believable, he created fake documents from reputable insurance companies like AIG and Lloyd's of London.
You're kidding, fake insurance documents.
Yep. These documents claimed that the investments were fully protected.
Wow, that's bold.
It worked for a while because no one thought someone would be that audacious. And to keep up appearances, you'd often pay back early investors with money from new investors. Classic Ponzi scheme stuff.
The whole thing was a house of cards waiting to collapse.
And that's exactly what happened. Banks started demanding repayments, investors got suspicious, and the cracks in his facade began to show.
So how did it all unravel? Who brought him down?
Well, a forensic accountant named Paul Glover enters the picture. And get this, Pearlman hired him. He was drowning in debt and desperate, hoping Glover could somehow squeeze more cash out of his dwindling assets.
He brought in the guy who ultimately exposed him. That's ironic.
It is. So Glover starts going through Pearlman's financial records, noticing inconsistencies, shoddy accounting, and these suspicious investments linked to a firm called Cohen and Siegel.
Cohen and Siegel. Never heard of them.
That's because they didn't exist. Glover decides to call this Cohen and Siegel firm to inquire about their work, and as he's dialing the number, guess what happens?
Don't tell me. The phone on Pearlman's desk starts ringing.
Bingo. It turned out Cohen and Siegel was just Pearlman himself, fabricating audits for his own schemes.
Wow, what a twist. Busted by his own phone. So what did Glover do?
He knew he'd uncovered something huge. He gathered up all the evidence and took it straight to the authorities.
And that's when the wall started closing in on Pearlman.
Yep. The jig was up. He fled the country, starting an international game of hide and seek.
Oh man, where'd he go?
From Germany to Spain, then Panama, Singapore, and finally Bali, Indonesia.
Bali. Really? That doesn't sound like a bad place to hide out.
It does, doesn't it? But it was a German tourist who recognized him at a resort buffet and tipped off the authorities.
Busted again. I guess you can't hide forever, so they brought him back to the U.S.
Yep, extradited him back to face the music. But even after his arrest, the story takes another bizarre turn. But that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Can't wait to hear what happens next. So last time we left off with Pearlman getting busted in Bali.
Yeah, talk about a fall from grace. From boy band mogul to fugitives hiding out in a tropical paradise.
And remember, this is a guy who meticulously crafted this image of success and legitimacy. It makes you wonder, where did it all begin? Was he always a con man even as a kid?
Right, like was there something in his childhood that kind of set the stage for all this?
Well, Tyler Gray really digs into this in his book, Hit Charade. He found that a lot of Pearlman's stories about his childhood didn't quite match up with what people who knew him back then remember.
So even as a kid, he was already spinning tales. What kind of stories was he telling?
He liked to paint this picture of himself as this super savvy entrepreneur, even as a youngster. But when you actually look into those stories, they kind of fall apart.
Like that story about him buying up all the lucrative paper routes as a kid, right? Remember reading about that?
Exactly. Sounds like a good story, but former paper boys from his neighborhood say it never happened.
So not exactly a straight shooter, even back then. What about his whole fascination with blimps? Where did that come from?
Well, according to Pearlman, it all started with the Goodyear blimp that flew near his apartment in Queens.
Okay, yeah, I can see that sparking a kid's imagination.
Right. He even claimed that he actually worked for Goodyear while he was in college.
So a blimp enthusiast turned blimp businessman. Makes sense.
Except there's a twist. His childhood friend, Alan Gross, tells a different story.
What's the real story?
It turns out it was actually Gross's apartment that faced the blimp landing site. And it was Gross who was obsessed with blimps and ended up working for Goodyear, not Pearlman.
Hold on, so Pearlman was taking credit for his friend's passion and experiences.
Seems that way. It's like he had this habit of, I don't know, embellishing his own story or taking bits and pieces of other people's lives to create this more impressive narrative for himself.
It's almost as if he was building this persona, you know, this carefully constructed image of himself that wasn't entirely real.
Yeah, and that persona, that image of success and charisma would become so crucial to his schemes later on. It allowed him to gain people's trust and convince them to invest in his ventures.
Absolutely. He knew how to play the part. People are often drawn to that confidence and charisma, even if there's something darker
It
underneath.
was a classic con man tactic.
So even in those early years, you see glimpses of the man he would become. A skilled storyteller, bit of fabulist, and someone who blurred the lines between reality and self-promotion.
It makes you wonder, is it all about the money for these guys? Or is there something else driving them?
Yeah, what is it about these elaborate schemes that draws them in?
Right. Is it some kind of need for validation? A desire for recognition?
I think for someone like Pearlman, it was definitely about more than just money. It was about proving himself, about being seen as successful and powerful.
But it's tragic, isn't it? They go to all these lengths to be admired and recognized, but in the end, they're exposed, their legacy is tarnished.
And the damage they leave behind. It's just awful. Speaking of damage, what happened to all those investors who lost their life savings? Did they ever get any of their money back?
Sadly, no, most of them didn't. They recovered some assets, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what was stolen.
It's a stark reminder that even in this world of glitz and glamour, these schemes have real consequences.
Absolutely. And it underscores the importance of doing your due diligence, you know? If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Words to live by, for sure. But, you know, we've talked a lot about the dark side of Pearlman's story. We can't forget that he did play a major role in shaping pop music history.
Oh, absolutely. He helped launch some of the biggest pop groups of all time. Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, they dominated the charts.
They were a cultural phenomenon.
And that's part of Pearlman's legacy. He had an eye for talent, a knack for creating marketable pop acts. But we have to acknowledge that his success was built on deceit.
Complicated legacy, for sure.
It's a reminder that success doesn't excuse unethical behavior.
Speaking of unethical behavior, Pearlman eventually faced justice for his crimes, right?
He did. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for conspiracy, money laundering, and bank fraud.
Wow, 25 years. That's a long time.
It was. And even in prison, he still clung to this belief that he'd make a comeback.
He never really accepted responsibility for what he did.
It doesn't seem like it. He saw himself as a misunderstood visionary, a victim of circumstance.
It's like he couldn't reconcile the reality of his actions with that persona he had built for himself.
Almost like that persona became a shield, protecting him from the truth.
It's a sad and ultimately tragic story.
Yeah, it really is. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how far are people willing to go for fame and fortune?
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale for sure. And, you know, when you think about it, Pearlman brought joy to so many people through the music he created.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Those boy bands were huge.
But at the same time, he was responsible for so much financial devastation. It's just incredible, the contrast.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? He had this amazing talent for spotting stars and creating hit music.
Right.
But then there's this whole other side to him, this dark side, this con man.
It makes you wonder, were those two sides connected somehow? Like, do you think his ambition to create these larger-than-life spectacles kind of fueled his willingness to, you know, cut corners and manipulate people?
That's an interesting question. It's possible, I guess. Maybe he thought, as long as I achieve my goals, the methods don't really matter.
Almost like the ends justified the means, you know?
That's a slippery slope, though. Pearlman's story is a reminder that integrity and ethical behavior really do matter, even when you're striving for big goals.
Totally agree. And it also reminds us that you can't always judge a book by its cover, right?
Exactly.
Pearlman presented this image of success and generosity, but underneath it all was this web of lies.
And it's a good lesson for all of us, really. Be careful who you trust, especially when it comes to your finances.
Right. Always do your research, ask questions. If something sounds too good to be true, well, you know the rest.
Exactly. And it's important to remember the real victims in all of this, the investors who lost their life savings. What happened to them after Pearlman was arrested?
That's what I keep thinking about. Did they ever get their money back?
Unfortunately, most of them didn't. The authorities tried to recover some assets, but it was just a small fraction of what was stolen.
That's so sad. It's easy to get caught up in the story, the drama of it all. But we can't forget about the real human cost.
You're absolutely right. Financial fraud has a ripple effect, impacting families and communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lou Pearlman's world, what are some key takeaways? What can we learn from his rise and fall?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that appearances can be deceiving. Don't be swayed by charisma or charm alone.
Trust your gut, do your homework.
Exactly. And remember, success built on lies is never going to last.
Right, integrity matters.
And finally, the truth always has a way of coming out. You can't hide from your actions forever.
It's a powerful reminder that actions have consequences. Lou Pearlman might have left his mark on pop music history, but his legacy will always be overshadowed by the harm he caused.
A cautionary tale, for sure.
Well said. It's a story that makes you think about your values, your own ambitions, and it reminds us to be careful about who we trust and the choices we make.
Absolutely.
Well, that's our deep dive into the world of Lou Pearlman, boy bands, and bankruptcy. A fascinating story with a lot of twists and turns and some important lessons along the way.
Thanks for having me. It's been great chatting.
Thanks for joining us. And to all our listeners out there, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more captivating stories and deep dives into the topics that matter. We'll see you next time.